Okay, so, 你好，我是 Stephanie. 我. Okay, somehow I've got a million windows open on my computer and decided I would start a video. Anyway, whoops. 我是 Stephanie. 我. Okay, if we were to do 我, are any of those three correct? Actually, don't answer that. I'm just going to keep listening to it until I start replicating it. I'm a really big fan of time kind of evens out. If you have authentic materials or authentic input, I'm a really firm believer that that explicit corrections aren't necessary. I know there's a lot of controversy on this within the language learning field, both in my home country and abroad, especially my home country, where explicit corrections are the norm. And that brings me to this feedback video. I was going to talk about the reader, but I think I'm going to do a separate video for that because this needs to be addressed. What do I want from my viewers? I do talk to you guys, but I don't think I've really told you what I want from you. And partially because I don't want to tell you what to do most of the time. But as you may have noticed, people leave different comments, and I'm super excited to get feedback. I'm studying in an isolated environment right now with my mobile phone and my computer, so I am super excited to speak to people either on social media or on YouTube and address any questions and just generally talk about the language and talk about learning the language. And I really, really enjoy doing that. However, as a language learner, being the sucky, slow-moving, frequent mistaked language learner that I am, and the sensitive plant that I am, I have never done well with the kind of language learning where you're corrected until you say it correct. Never. That is one of the top things that has stopped me from continuing learning a language. And I've noticed that I've had students that fell on both sides of that, as if it's a dichotomy. Let's pretend that it is, where there's people who do really, really well with constant corrections, and they will just keep going and going and going, and not get at all defeatist over making the mistakes, and somehow they'll trudge on learning new things even though they keep getting corrected on the thing that isn't the focus of the day or even the focus of the conversation. And then on the other side, you have people like me who are focused on content and focused on communication, and if there are some errors either in grammar or in pronunciation, but it's generally understood, then that's what keeps us learning and what keeps us using the language, and that is where I fall into. So the way that languages are generally learned in the US is it's heavy on this side, on the accuracy side. Like so heavy on the accuracy side that is 90% of why I left a PhD program on technology and language learning. It's a much bigger thing than that, but I respect the program and the people and the experiences that I had too much to do that on YouTube. But that is my viewpoint. That is my, I wouldn't say block, because I'm completely comfortable with where I am with focusing on going forward with a language. I've never been someone who's been into a million times it has to be accurate in order to get meaning conveyed. I am someone who wants to just communicate and keep talking and keep having interesting conversations. And yes, errors can stop communication. Absolutely. And that's what negotiation of language is. And sorry, my throat's really sore. I've been doing speaking tests all week, and my throat is like, I feel like a singer without the singing talent. So errors can stop, but we, even as native speakers of a language, we constantly are asking each other, did you mean this? Did you say this? Like 15 and 50 is the perfect example, right? Did you mean 1-5 or 5-0? I said that to another native speaker even just this week, because I was disbelieving the number that he was saying, and it was said a little bit quickly, so I wanted to make sure I understood the number that was in the conversation. So there's constantly questions about content in language that we're using to convey meaning all the time. So early on in my language teaching and in my language learning, I've focused on keeping the conversation moving, and I've done really well in language teaching jobs where that has been the goal. but with keeping accuracy in there enough to keep going. It's not, the dichotomy I'm talking about is not focus only on accuracy, focus only on fluency. There's a balance in there, but I find that the balance is really skewed sometimes. And for me, I'm even off balance because I really, really, really only want to know when meaning is not conveyed. I personally don't really want to be corrected in the middle of a sentence when I'm saying one sound wrong. Because to be quite honest with you, and I'm noticing this even in China where I barely understand the dialectical differences, but I can hear differences in Chinese, even if I don't understand where they're from or the words that they're saying, I can hear different accents already. And I guess I kind of could before, but I really can now because some of the words that people say often are words that I know, some, not many, and so they really, really are highlighted in a sentence when I hear people saying them. So even with that, with dialectical differences, with just speech differences, some people speak differently, even the same language. Some people speak much more back in their throat, even if it's a non-throaty language. Some people speak very here. Some people don't move their lips very much. I mean, it's just, there's personality differences too with language. And you add that together, then you add the regional stuff. We already talked about that. So there's a lot of things that go on in language. So there's a lot of language negotiation. And so my language teaching was very heavy on language negotiation. One of the first things I taught my students was like, we called it emergency language. It was that whole, what did you say? Can you spell that? Do you mean this? That kind of language where you can negotiate the meaning of it when you don't understand it, which even when you're first learning a language can really help you, like saying más despacio, por favor, which is much slower, please, in Spanish, because Spanish is a beautiful language, but most 99.9% of Spanish speakers speak it very quickly. And as a beginner, it's really hard to understand anything. And in Argentina, where I first tried to learn Spanish, it was really, really hard to understand people. So I used that a lot. And so that emergency language really helps with the language negotiation. But my point is not that. My point is this. What do I want from you? I know I ask burning questions, and if you know information, leave it in the comments for the burning questions, right? And I know I ask kind of hypothetical questions or direct questions to you during the videos. Sometimes I'm probably asking questions to the ether, or I'm asking questions to myself because I'm thinking through the language that I'm learning or the process of the language learning stage that I'm at. You can comment on those too. Completely and utterly fine. You know, I mean, I can delete comments, but I think I've deleted one, and it was really inappropriate. So over, 3-4 months now, I've deleted one, and it had nothing to do with language learning. It was just really off task, let's just say. And I'm very excited that the comments have been very focused up until this point, but there are some comments, and it's not one person. I'm not talking to one person. There are some comments that are starting to lean towards that accuracy heavy thing. And here's what I learned in teaching first year writing at universities in the US and teaching academic English to my students in China and Vietnam and Malaysia, is that if you tend to balance out your error corrections with things that they're doing well, it tends to keep people going more motivation-wise. That return on motivation phrase that I hopefully created, I think, and that I use a ridiculous amount of time, it tends to keep that going. Now, the writing classes I'm talking about were with language learners, but they were required courses, so their motivation was already lower than somebody who had elected to take a course. So what I ended up doing after a little while of error correcting like crazy and watching their motivation level go down, I used to color code and number their errors, and I used to have students switch papers and like color code different errors of their partner, and it got to the point where there were so many error corrections, especially in the elementary and the pre-intermediate levels, where they didn't know where to start. And so I started to do what some of my favorite second language acquisition folks do, which is you pick the most common errors, and for me, the most common errors that they make that interfere with meaning on this side. So what I started to do is I picked out, if it was a language issue, not a flow issue, I would pick out the 1 or 2 mistakes that they made often that would interfere with meaning. And usually with language learners, that was verb tenses, because there's a ton, right, we're talking about learning English. There is a ton of time meaning in verb tenses. So verb tenses were super important. Vocabulary was not so much. There's a lot of controversy on vocabulary correction helping or not helping. That seems to be more of an input issue on seeing the vocabulary in its actual used form more often, and that helping more than correction. But it was vocabulary, and I think, no, not vocabulary, sorry, verb tenses, and usually for my Chinese students, and I'm beginning to understand this a lot more, learning English, my Chinese students learning English, it was punctuation, because punctuation in Chinese and punctuation in English is incredibly different. And now that I have seen punctuation in Chinese, I get this. They were trying to use the punctuation, the comma, 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 comma for like a paragraph in English, and we don't do that. Generally speaking, especially at the level of the essays that they were writing, at the level of the text, not just essays, but the different kinds of texts they were writing. So I would pick those, and once they got a master on those, or at least corrected them out, because it's a drafting process, once they started getting rid of those errors, then I could correct other things and help them fix other errors. So we would do like 1 or 2 things at a time, but here's the thing. In addition to that, I would list an equal, if not slightly longer amount of things they were doing correctly. For a large part of the writing that we did in the classes in the US, there was a very formulaic academic English kind of essay, and there was a set way of doing it, and you generally had your thesis in a certain place, you generally had topic sentences, blah, blah, blah. You all know what I'm talking about, basically. And if you don't, let me know. I'll put a link below with a very colorful picture with the paragraph structure. And so it's pretty set. So once they started to do it in that way, that would be one of their pluses. Hey, look, your verb tenses need some help, but the format is very easy to follow. You're doing the format correctly. Because that's something to point out, is your language and your writing don't completely suck. You're doing things right. And you're doing some things that probably want to be changed, but you're doing things right also. And what were some of the other things? They're very good. They seem to be very good at teaching cohesive devices in China and learning English. Things like, things that make things smooth out. However, and so in addition to those kinds of things seem to be really, really well. So I point those out. If they use some vocabulary, some higher level vocabulary, or some vocabulary that had precise meaning well, boom, would point that out. So it just depends on what they were using well, but I would equal it out. 1 or 2 things they needed to improve to make the meaning more clear, and 2 or 3 things that they were doing well already, that they could keep doing well. So balancing those out, I did notice that my writing students, and writing's hard, but my writing students who were language learners also, their motivation was more sustainable. It was still a writing class, it was still required, it was still a very challenging curriculum, but I found that there wasn't as much of a, ugh, the day after grades came back. There was more of a, huh, and so there was that. So there was the balancing out of that. Why I'm saying this is I request, if possible, the same from you. If you're going to point out something that I do wrong, either in pronunciation or meaning, please do, but could you please point out something that I'm doing correctly? I know this seems a bit narcissistic, but it's not, because I honestly am practicing by myself, and I will try to use some of the language I'm learning out in the real world, but most of the vocabulary I'm learning doesn't really connect to the real world yet. So there's very little reinforcement that I get in my language learning. So if you really do want to comment, I ask, if you can, please give me a little bit of that balanced approach. That's just what I need. Language learners are different, and I don't think I've been this explicit about it to this point, but I do feel like it's time that I request, if you can, please balance it out. If you're going to point out an error, please point out something I'm doing well. If I'm not doing anything well, then so be it. Maybe even just say that, hey, look, you've made a mistake here, 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 and here. I don't really hear anything that you've done well in this video. Fair enough. Fair enough. I'm sure so many of these things I'll be studying and I'll get an idea for a video, and as soon as I've studied something new, I'll make a video, and I'm sure a lot of it sounds awful. A lot of it might sound awful. I might be completely wrong on some of my assumptions about that grammar point or about that vocabulary, so yeah, I'm going to make a lot of mistakes, and I'm doing it very visibly. And I'm not saying don't comment. And again, this isn't one person. This is over a few months of comments. I'm noticing a trend in some directions, and some folks aren't doing this at all. So be it. And it's not like there's hundreds of comments. I mean, this channel isn't that popular yet. But I am saying I am this kind of language learner that's much more focused on function of the language than I am on complete accuracy of the language. Focusing on accuracy for too long in the US is one of the things that stopped me from learning a language. It frustrated me to the point of just saying, I don't need to. No thanks. And so I'm over here. Yay, Halliday. All right, so that's a person, by the way. MK Halliday? Yeah, Australian. Go look it up. So that's that. So if you point out an error, please point out something I'm doing well. It can be super tiny. It doesn't have to be something big. And I know I'm asking you to kind of put on a teacher hat, but if you're leaving comments about the language and about errors, you kind of are putting on the teacher hat already. So put it on correctly. Correctly. See? Accuracy. It's hard to take off the American cape. Man, and we are certainly not the only country that is very, very, very accuracy-based. We are not. However, I don't like it for language learning. I think it's too skewed in that direction. Way too skewed. Oh, my wrists, by the way, are doing so much better. This is more preventative than anything. Within 1 week's time, just doing this and some icing, it's so much better. I'm being much more careful with holding my cell phone when I'm studying or making videos. It's on a tripod right now, my new tripod, so I'm doing much better. I don't want to go back to that strain that I was having for a few days. That was really awful. Yikes. Selfie wrist is real, people. Ugh. Okay, so I hope this has been clear, and I hope I'm not asking too much of you. Again, you don't need to error correct me. You don't. I'm more interested in talking about the language and language learning process, but some of you, I understand, want to leave those comments. I completely understand that. It's probably massively cringeworthy to hear somebody butcher the language like I'm doing it, and you probably want to help. I get it. I totally get it. Once I start listening to other people learn other languages again on YouTube, I'm probably going to have that reaction to some stuff, although I don't know that many languages. I don't know any people that are learning beginner Spanish, which is the only thing I've gotten a little far in language learning wise. So I don't know that I will have that reaction, but I can see that happening. My equivalent is when I've seen people teach for the first few times, and I think I know language teaching rather well. I have had that kind of cringy reaction where I'm like, this is their beginning, they need to go through their process, and to not be too cruel and to not comment so much that it demotivates them from learning more about teaching. So I do have that parallel that I can relate to, more so than language learning, because I don't have a high level of language learning to cringe when other people butcher a language yet. Okay, I hope this makes sense, and I hope it doesn't offend anybody, and I really hope to keep the comments going on YouTube. I've had very little time to advertise the channel and to comment back in the month of August, but I have 1.5 more days of work in this maddening month, and then I have months of study time coming to me and YouTube time and social media time. So I'll be back online very, very, very shortly, and I appreciate and adore all of you. So I hope this doesn't deter anybody from sticking with this channel and sticking with following this maddening process of me hopefully learning Chinese sometime in this decade. Oh, it's 2017. Maybe I shouldn't speak that soon. All right, thank you so much, and more soon. 再见.